Jon Coe as our next speaker. Jon is a leading innovator in the zoo planning and design field, and one of the founders with others of immersion design as a concept. He has over 60 papers already in place. He's active all over the world. He's currently working on landscape design projects in Afghanistan and in many other countries. He's now based in Australia. His recent clients include parks in Bali, Sichuan, China, in Kabul, as I mentioned, and also in India. Jon's present interests lie in mitigating the confluence of nature and culture and creating enriching and sustainable environments for people, plants, and animals. I assure you we could spend the entire 2 days just listening to Jon Coe.
Thank you all very much, and I really appreciate everyone coming, and I appreciate bringing David and Monica and myself all the way from Australia and Europe to join you. As exhibit designers, zoo designers, and sometimes called zoo architects, we're actually all landscape architects, so a few hairs go up when we're called architects, but we'll accept that as an academic category. But I hope to prove to you that we don't like staying in that box or any other box, and that one of the great blessings and challenges of our business is that we touch all the other businesses in the zoo and conservation area. And to the extent that we can do that and help build bridges, to that extent do we advance and the energy of the profession advance. Before I start, I was concerned that there are some built-in biases to this forum, to this symposium. So I want to get those on the table so that we understand how they affect our perceptions about the future. Now, I'm not being critical about these because they're perfectly natural, you know, and they're normal and healthy and natural, but as you go through life, you always have to check your assumptions. So there's a North American bias. We read, and I'll talk later about, you know, the next generation of economic boom is in India and China, declining economies in North America and Europe. And I'll make the assertion right now that the future of zoos will be determined in Asia, not in North America. So where are the Asian spokeswomen to join us here to discuss the future of zoos? The future of zoos in America and North America is, I think, very predictable. The future of zoos in China, in Pakistan, in Chile, is a lot less predictable. I think there's an economic bias. Or we only consider the future of wealthy zoos and wealthy people, like, in other words, us. Or are we looking at the future of our zoos, the evolution, continued evolution, you know, in a 1 or 2 percentile of the world's wealth, with donors like Dr. Conway's been able to get, Mrs. Hout and others. You know, is that all we're looking at in the future, or in this symposium? There's a paradigm about the elite zoo, and this subject did come up, and I was very happy to hear it, that what's the measure of success? You know, is the measure of success the highest achievement of the 5 best zoos in the world? Now, we all know that elite elements of culture, of technology, of all endeavors have a disproportionate impact on the rest of the world. So I'm not knocking it. I think that's great. But do they outweigh the collective burden of all the world's zoos, the good, the bad, and the ugly, as Terry Maple would say? You know, if there are, whatever it is, around 200 zoos here, 200 zoos, accredited zoos in India, I'm not sure how many in Europe, you know, maybe there's 2,000 other zoos, and what was the number about, you know, non-accredited American zoos? We'll multiply that around the world. What is the impact of that on conservation, on education, on animal welfare? And is what we're doing, does it even matter, you know, weighed in that scale? And if it does, what are we going to do about it? You know, how are we going to take our knowledge, but hopefully not our bias, to other parts of the world? Dr. Rabb had a wonderful diagram of the evolution of zoos. I thought I would have seen it 5 times by now. I actually counted on it, so I didn't bring my own. It shows a diagonal progression from the Royal Menagerie to the Victorian Zoo to the modern zoo to the biopark up to Paradise, as if evolution were linear. But we all know evolution has never been linear. You know, the branching tree, it doesn't have just one trunk and one limb and one twig. If we put the Royal Menagerie at the bottom of this, in the roots of this tree, we had Royal Menageries 3,500 years ago in Egypt. We have Royal Menageries today. We'll have Royal Menageries 100 years from now. We had Victorian zoos 100 years ago. We have Victorian zoos today. We'll have Victorian zoos 100 years from now. All of these progress as new shoots and new buds come off and create new forms. The others don't go away. And so I think when we look to the future, we have to look at a new paradigm, well, the old paradigm of evolution, which is really a continuum of past, present, and future coexisting. Now, being a bit of a history nerd, I had to chart out a lot of these things. I don't expect you to be able to read it from there. I'm just trying to show you that I'm trying to build a broad base of understanding for myself, looking where we've been and where we might go. And the founding stone of all this is biophilia. We have zoos today because of biophilia. We'll have something 100 years from now because of biophilia. But the expression of biophilia is cultural. You know, zoos happen to be one of our expressions of biophilia. You know, eating monkey brains is another expression of biophilia in other cultures. So I'm going to focus on this area. And I'm going to try to get across diagrammatically this idea of continuing growth into the future without really evolving different forms. So each of these, I've just picked some. The modern zoo really is a combination of immersion and virtual and traditional and all these other things. Any zoo you go to will have new and old and Victorian and even start from scratch zoos. You know, 20 years from now, some of them, they'll be obsolete. Only they'll also be heritage and we can't change them. So what I'm trying to get across, these are different aspects of zoos, could be all combined in one or could be separate, not too important right now. I'm going to see the immersion zoo, which is the naturalistic, the back to nature version, evolving to something I'll call the unzoo. We'll talk about that more. And maybe modern zoos will go to bioparks, as Mike Robinson suggested. I don't think very many will, actually, but a few will, and some have. Desert Museum is a fabulous example, and I'll continue on that track. Virtual zoos will evolve further into techno-zoos, which just incorporates all kinds of technology. So while the immersion zoo, unzoo track is the back to nature track, the techno-zoo is the technology track. The frozen zoo is incredibly important. In the end, will probably be the most important zoo of all. And now these will evolve. So in the future now we'll have that many different kinds, and I didn't even talk about the old chart. So what are the assumptions I'm basing all this on? I'm basing, in the next period, a collapse of the consumer-based bubble that we've all been living in since World War II, but actually since the Industrial Revolution. We've been living on credit. And the credit is unrenewable resources. And that's going to end. Technology and our preparedness will give us a precipitous crash or a safe crash landing. And, we need to work on those things, but it's going down. And globalization will slow, and by that I mean the mass transportation of goods around the world will slow, but the mass transportation of ideas around the world will speed up. There will be a chaotic retreat to low-growth, community-based lifestyles. This is the Jeffersonian democracy, that some of us dream about. In the Western economies, that will go down. Large urban zoos will definitely decline. Regional sanctuaries will spread. There'll be a new emphasis on animals that are hardy in your zone, whether or not they're native, and they'll probably pretty soon escape and be wild, and if not indigenous, they'll certainly be feral. Consumption-based bubbles in new economies like Asia and Brazil will actually grow. That's why I say the next 50 years will be determined in places like Brazil and India, China. But they'll be short-lived too. Brazil is probably the only one of those countries that has substantial natural resources. The others are importing them, so I predict a short-lived bubble for them. And West will export zoo technology. We'll also try to export our cultural bias. That's not going to work very well. And then there'll be a polarization that we see today. The middle class around the world has always been fragile. It'll get a lot worse. So we'll have gated communities and gated economies, and the rich will get richer and the poor will get poorer, and we'll have the zoos for the rich and we'll have whatever it is for the poor, the meat markets for the poor. So right now, these are the centers of economic and cultural development and innovation. I put Singapore in there as a very important, one of the best zoos in the world. But this is where the next economic boom is taking place. We see Brazil, perhaps places like Poland and Russia. The Emirates will continue for a while as their oil lasts, India, China, secondarily in Indonesia, and a few of the African countries. So where do we go from here? Well, the immersion zoo is one of the models we're talking about, and David discussed it a little bit. I think it's a fabulous approach, and I've been dedicated to it most of my career, but it's a culturally biased approach. Even though it goes back to biophilia and back to fundamental genetically based instincts, that's what's designed on, is it suitable for other cultures? In a culture like China, where there is no tradition of staying on a path, there is no tradition of waiting in a queue, there is no tradition of not throwing rocks, are we going to change all of those traditions so that they love an immersion zoo? They want an immersion zoo, there's no question. I've talked to them. They say, can I have one of those, But, and then also on a holy day, they'll have 30,000 visitors. So, is this a transferable idea? It is for a few and the wealthy, yeah. Broadly, no. Immersion Zoo will continue to develop in new and clever ways. This is in Cochrane, Manitoba. For those of you who can't tell, there is glass between the species there. The night zoo is definitely a trend that everybody should follow within a tropical zone. Alain went from a day zoo to a night zoo, and the visitation increased fivefold. Why not? And as far as immersion goes, you don't have to hide anything at night. You just spotlight the stuff you want to show. I've done a lot of work with animal rotation, both as an enrichment feature and a physical exercise feature. Philadelphia Zoo has really taken it on recently with this tube that goes through the park. I forget exactly how far it is, but it's like 1,000 feet. It's pretty good length. And it works for all arboreal or semi-arboreal animals of this size. And that's actually a place to get to or get through, but it's also a place to hang out. And you can browse the leaves as you go by, you can browse the fruit. There are actually stations where you can pull off and spend some time. And the important thing I want to get across is that Philadelphia Zoo now has a master plan for taking this rotation idea throughout the zoo. So we'll have lightweight rotation, middleweight rotation for gorillas and bears, heavyweight rotation for rhinos and giraffes. And every animal will basically be able to circumambulate the zoo in some fashion. And that's a future for small landlocked zoos that don't have a lot of space. And yeah, it's a linear cage, of course, but the animal has a lot of choices where it wants to go. There are a lot of other options to it. So, connecting the whole zoo with some interaction, and why does this animal have to spend its life in this area and this animal spend its life there? Why can't it have a web of, like Heidegger's circulation concept? The Techno Zoo has an animal side and a visitor side, and what you're seeing here is available today. Columbus Zoo, the elephants can take a shower whenever they want to and wet their night brows. Just the microchips that we use for ID can be used for the animal to open and close doors, access food individually. These are coded to that animal. At the same time, as was mentioned earlier, it can give you data points on cortisol levels, on blood pressure, on heart rate. And the guy down in the corner is recording all this as research while the animal goes about its life and takes more and more control of its life. So the whole thing here is giving animals control of the environment. Technology is here today to do lots of that if any of you want to try it. So that's a dare to all the zoos out there. The Techno-Zoo also have a human interactive component. These are photographs provided from the National Zoo on their interactive cognitive language sessions, so that, very soon in the future you can talk with the animals. They can tell you what they want to say or don't want to say, or they're going to walk away and not talk to you. The frozen zoo, of course, is absolutely critical as these regions come under stress, and definitely a Pleistocene zoo, yeah, why not? Virtual zoo. Right now it's basically a website. Early on it was hoped that the animal welfare people were hoping it would replace the zoo. I think the zoos will probably take it on as well as everything else, but you can access it from the zoo's website. You can access it at the zoo itself. And of course, it will get amazingly sophisticated. And while I've talked about the sort of the return to nature, this is, remember, the tech side, where you're returning to nature in your head, right? You put on something, or something's embedded in your skull, and you go into yourself almost as a high-tech meditation to experience nature. So, that's the breadth we're talking about. Big dominant architecture has been a hallmark of zoos since zoos began. When immersion came out, it was a response against dominant architecture and inorganic thoughts. And, we worked really hard to tear down lots of buildings, but they're still there, and they've always been the alternative. And through much of the world where there aren't specialist designers, that's what you're going to get. So good, bad, or ugly, they also have to evolve. And at the Eden Project in Cornwall, they've recreated the domes in a far more sustainable way, far less energy, and they're big enough that inside you can have really quite a nice simulated habitat. You can have big enough areas if you want to pay the money for pretty good animals to have a pretty good life, and they can really open up for natural ventilation and so forth. So some of the wealthy zoos will be able to do this, but the energy constraints, the cost of new energy will be so high that it will be quite rare. Bioparks are just a version of this. This shows a high-tech biopark. I much more like the idea of the biopark like the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum, which is in the landscape. But we will see both, but I think zoos will become more specialized rather than more generalized, much as I regret it. Modern zoos are already going green. The Madagascar exhibit at the Bronx Zoo is a gold LEED standard. And to the extent that the Bronx is doing that and investing in their cogen systems, they are future-proofing themselves. But a lot of the zoos in the world which are building these megastructures and aren't future-proofing them, they're either be empty or they'll be unheated, and you'll have to put a local animal in them because you just won't be able to afford to operate them. A lot of green talk these days, green roofs and so forth, but to me that's what I call shallow green or greenwash. So I mentioned a much deeper concept of green, which is not just a physical thing, but a philosophical thing. When you design this building, do you write a charter for the rights of the plants that live in the building and the animals that live around the building and the visitors who use the building? And then the building becomes the tool for meeting your charter obligations to all these species. In this case, in Australia, it captures its own rainwater, generates its own energy, produces its own animal food, and maybe you can have an overnight accommodation there. It's much more like a village, like a self-sustaining village, than like a zoo. The zoo is one of my favorite concepts, but a little hard to grasp because it falls in between these different trends. But quickly, the history, the old zoos, the humans dominated. Hagenbeck zoos are still human domination. The immersion zoos present animals as dominant. But remember, all of these zoos, no matter how humane and how clever, are based on captivity and coercion. Fundamentally, you go down through everything, no matter how well they're done, captivity and coercion. But what we're finding is that the amazing advances in behavioral enrichment and positive reinforcement training, we're finding examples again and again and again of animals preferring to cooperate with us for medical procedures, preferring to come with us for recreational procedures, preferring to hang out with us. So to the extent, so the zoo is a work in progress. It's not here. It's a lot harder for polar bears than it is, for catfish or something. So, but the idea is it's a progression towards an ideal where the human-animal interaction is mediated by collaboration, mutualism, even symbiosis. And we can do that in our zoos today, and many zoos actually are, they just haven't identified it. And the common denominator of all of those is that you control the people, not the animals, or you more and more control the people. So the people are contained in some acceptable way, while the animals are loose all around them. And of course, that's the safari park, that's all kinds of unzoos that exist around us today. And other expressions, the swimming with dolphins, all of these are a transition from the present zoo on. And I could go on with examples of how this exists all around us today. So it's partly about co-opting the cooperation of free-ranging birds and animals in your park. It's partly about blurring the boundaries of where your park is and where the neighborhood is and where the reserve is, the things that Mr. Shapiro talked about. So, okay, looking ahead now, what's the longer-term version? Consumption-based economies all around the world will collapse. World population peaks and begins a gradual decline somewhere between 2050 and 2070. Unprecedented global migration and conflict as the resources shift. And the flood water, sea levels rise, and rivers flood, and all the things that we're seeing today, you know, they're all going to happen. And so what we're going to see is some of the major economic powers, maybe China, for example, will probably collapse in about 3 or 5 ethnic states. We'll see that in many parts of the world, just as the Soviet Union collapsed back into ethnic states, and they started subdividing into sub-ethnic states. So we're going to go from a United Nations worldview back to a kind of federalist, diverse, negotiated set of economic and political rights. And with it, a lot of the protections for national parks and for huge areas are going to fall to the goodwill of the community there, because the federal government will no longer exist or will no longer be able to protect them. And then the new growth bubbles emerge in resource-rich extraterrestrial colonies. The bubble follows the resource. So we started with that. Now we're going to the next 2 subjects in the long term, third-generation conservation and neogen. First generation is preservation. Some people in this room, Dr. Conway among them, have been very important in setting this up. It's began with the sort of John Muir, Teddy Roosevelt, and so forth. But the main thing is it's putting a fence around a place, keeping some things in, some things out. Now, that's worked very well, and we hope it continues, but these are incredibly fragile in terms of climate change. The second generation conservation is restoration, and Lord knows we need a lot of that. This is an example of an artificially created wetland at Hillsville Sanctuary. So I asked my friends, what's a third generation? And everybody says, well, what do you mean? Well, there's going to be something else, isn't there? So I made it up. And I said a third generation of conservation is accommodation. Let's just live with nature and accept that we are nature, and that nature is us, and nature is our neighborhood, and the weed in our driveway is as natural as endangered species on the other side of the world. And how do we accommodate all of these things so that we have one world? I sort of got ahead of myself there, but and I, again, if I had a lot of time with their question, I gave many, many examples of how this is going on to this day. But the more we can move to that, it's as simple as a bird feeder all the way up to some very sophisticated networks and collaborative things. But the important thing is it's community-based. It's ground up. It's not government mandated. Neogen, yeah, we're going to have that too. You know, Jurassic Park, yeah, probably somewhere among the wealthy colonies. Chimeran pets will be a big hit. Everybody will want a glow-in-the-dark monkey-rabbit-cat cross. And then what about beyond it, you know? Well, time goes on, teleportation, time travel. As we get, you know, string theory evolves into kind of a spaghetti and meatball theory, and we start finding out how to negotiate, you know, between parallel universes, you know, there's no reason that won't lead to both time travel and space travel and so forth. So virtual zoos, frozen zoos, neo-zoos, immersion zoos, all will take off in space and go wherever we go. And then many unimagined things. So that kind of fills in, you see the whole big shift up there. So how about, teleporting into a parallel universe in the middle of an elephant herd where they can't touch you and you can't touch them, but you're right in the middle of them. Off-planet zoos, this is actually NASA developed these concepts in 1976, and we just added the animals. So until then, in 100 years, I look forward to a very exciting future, and may we all live in changing times. Thank you.